For those of you that have already signed up, thank you very much. I'll challenge you still to maybe sign up for one more committee. Whatever help we can get, it's going to be an exciting year, so thank you all for that. And Rich Stivers has our program today.
Thanks, Dave. I think our club and Twin Falls is pretty fortunate to have the two gentlemen that are going to make the presentations today in our area. They're on in fact, they're kind of on an all-star book tour of the Magic Valley. They were in Sun Valley yesterday. They're going to be in Pocatello this evening, then headed to eastern Idaho, the Salmon area, and then back to points north and west. As I said, we've got two guest speakers. Chris Carlson is one, and I'll just briefly read from the bio that I've condensed it a little bit and have taken out some of the incriminating parts of Chris's checkered past. Born in Kellogg about 66 years ago, graduated from Central Valley High School and attended Columbia on a scholarship where he received his BA in 3 years by taking maximum course loads allowed and attending summer school so he could participate in the fall riots, the sit-ins at Columbia. In 1969, he began work on his Master of Arts in English Literature at Idaho State University. In January of 1970, he became the chief correspondent in Washington, D.C. for the Anchorage Daily News. After 2 years, he began a lifelong association with Idaho Governor Cecil D. Andrus and returned to Idaho to become the governor's press secretary. 5 years later, he returned to Washington, D.C. as Assistant Secretary of the Interior for Public Affairs when Andrus became Interior Secretary during the presidency of Jimmy Carter. In 1981, Governor John Evans named him to the newly created Northwest Power Planning Council. In November of that year, he resigned to begin his private sector public relations firm, the Rocky Company, and that was in 81. In 84, he was lured back to Spokane, where he worked with Kaiser Aluminum, which made him the vice president for Northwest Public Affairs. In January of 89, he left to be the founding member and opened the Spokane office of what would become the region's largest independent public affairs firm. In 1999, Chris took a medical disability retirement from the firm, but has remained active in the public arena. He writes a weekly political column carried by 3 papers and 2 blog sites in Idaho. He's the author of Cecil Andrus, Idaho's Greatest Governor, and Metamont Reflections, a book of essays on other notable Idahoans and issues he has dealt with over a 40-year career. And I had to ask him where Metamont was, and I think he'll probably tell you during the course of his presentation. Enough Chris. Randy Stapilus is the editor and publisher of the Reidenbaugh Press, edits the Idaho Weekly Briefing and the Snake River Basin Adjudication Digest, and has written a number of books about Idaho, including Paradox Politics and the Idaho Political Field Guide. He has worked for newspapers in Boise, Pocatello, Nampa, Lewiston, and Coeur d'Alene, and his weekly column on Idaho politics runs in several Idaho newspapers. After living in Idaho for about 30 years, he and his wife, Linda, now live in Carlson, Oregon. So I don't know which, do you want to go first, Chris? And take it from there. Would you please help me welcome Chris and Randy to our meeting?
Thank you all. It's a pleasure to be here. It's good to look out on the crowd and see some old acquaintances, John Rochalt, Kent Just, Curtis Eaton. It's good to be here. Allow me a brief personal note. Twin Falls is where my dear mother was born, 1924, many years ago. Her father, Fergus Briggs Sr., founded the National Laundry, and then sold to Troy Parisian, and they moved to Gooding, and then on to Pocatello. Grandpa Fergus was a lifelong member of Club 25 in Pocatello, and his oldest son, Fergus Briggs Jr., who took over the National Laundry from Grandpa, also was a Rotarian. So it's great to be among a good group of Rotarians, and I can't tell you how delighted I was to see the state song sung, because it doesn't always happen anymore, and it's good to hear it. I asked Rich if I could maybe make one brief joke, and it might have a little bit of a partisan tinge to it, but he said you all have a sense of humor, so I have a good friend named Tim Olson. Some of you may know him. He was the longtime lobbyist for Blue Shield Blue Cross. He also was a pretty good basketball player, went to Idaho State on a scholarship. He was born in Kellogg also, and one time we were having a drink, sitting down and talking about things, and he started talking about Kellogg, and I have to tell you, he is one of many of what I call my black-hearted Republican friends. And so anyway, he was talking about how it was kind of nifty, and if I'd stayed in the area, maybe we would have played on the basketball team and all that kind of thing. And he said, I think the similarities are really neat. And I looked at him, I said, Tim, there's one big difference between you and I besides the partisan orientation. When it comes time to meet the Maker, I want to be buried in Kellogg. And he looked at me and he said, Chris, why on earth would you want to do that? And I said, Tim, so I can keep on voting Democrat. My book, Metamont Reflections. People do ask, where the hell is Metamont? And so I deliberately put it into the title. Physically, it's about as the crow flies, halfway between Coeur d'Alene and St. Mary's. Any of you familiar with southern Kootenai County? You take exit 34 off I-90 and head for St. Mary's. We're 12.5 miles down the road on Cave Lake, which is the largest of the chain lakes that parallels the South Fork of the Coeur d'Alene. It's a beautiful area. It's a migratory pathway for all sorts of birds. I remember one morning I woke up and there were 30 pelicans outside. Now that's the state bird of Louisiana, folks, so it's unusual to see them that far north. But we have bear, we have moose, we have elk, and one morning when I was going out to the mailbox, a nice big wolf went leaping over the road in front of me. So it's a primitive area, and we don't have cell coverage either, so... Anyway, Metamont Expectations. It's a book of essays that deal with people and issues that I covered or was involved with over 40 years in the public arena. I think it's got something of interest, and I hope that it generates a little controversy. When we went to KLIX this morning, I found out, much to my delight, that my recommendation in one of the chapters in the book that my old body, the Northwest Power Planning Council, I suggest that it's outlived its usefulness. It ought to be abolished. 3 governors of the 4 Northwest governors can merely send a letter to the Interior Secretary and it's done. And frankly, its main charge was to come up with plans that would restore and enhance the wild runs of salmon and steelhead, and they've failed miserably. They've spent $221 million during their existence. More to the point, I asked the Bonneville Power Administration, how much has the administration spent trying to restore salmon and steelhead runs in the first 10 years of this century? You want to guess the number? Who? John, you're double, but it's $7.35 billion. And but it's been wasted. I mean, all of the biological plans, the biops as they call them, have been rejected by the courts. And so I suggest it's time to abolish this body and see if we can come up with something else. Much to my surprise, Governor Otter, who likes to say he's for less government, this morning, or not this morning, but in a previous show with KLIX, said, no, we got to keep the council. I think they're doing an okay job. And I guess I just scratched my head. To me, it's a prime target, and it would be less of the ratepayer and taxpayers' money. But so there's that recommendation. There's a recommendation that the 4 lower Snake dams be breached, and I got out of Lewiston alive before too many people knew that that was in the book. I have a chapter on what I call the 800-pound gorilla, which is the influence, pervasive and extensive, of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints on the political and cultural life of Idaho. And I recount, for example, that I think anybody that aspires to higher office in the state of Idaho has to understand that it's a very influential force. And from time to time, Governor Andrus has wannabes come to talk to him. And one of the questions he often asks them is, well, who have you talked to on the Committee of 9? And there's almost always this blank look. John knows who the Committee of 9 is. It's the 9 water masters of the Upper Snake River Basin. It's one of the most influential behind-the-scenes groups in Idaho, and you better believe they can make or break candidacies depending on what they think your views are on the primacy of upstream water rights and issues like that. Water is very important to Idaho, and anyone that wants to serve the state better understand that, better understand the history and the influence of the LDS Church. I happen to think that it's somewhat of a myth, this separation between church and state. It's an ideal, but the fact of the matter is churches deal with social issues. Every issue, everything in life is political, and so we might as well acknowledge that it's politics. I'm not saying that they do anything untoward or illegal. I think they exercise all their constitutional rights, just as other churches that are involved in the political process. But I think it's going to be an interesting read, and I encourage you to stop by and buy a copy. I'll give you a card, and if you don't like it, give me a call, and let's talk about it. I do want to thank my publisher, Randy Stapilus, who encouraged me to do this book, and I think without further ado, I'd like to turn the program over to Randy.
Well, thank you, Chris. I enjoyed working on the book with you and helping out with putting that together. It has something in common with the book that I had worked on as a co-author not too long before that. A few months ago, we put out a book called Idaho 100, which I co-wrote with Marty Peterson. Marty worked for the University of Idaho for many years. He was head of the Centennial Commission when the Centennial occurred back in 1990. Has done a lot of things in Idaho, but those people who know him fairly well know that probably his singular passion is Idaho history. We got into a discussion about who are the people who made things happen, who made things change in Idaho over the course of the states and the territories and pre-territorial history. And that was a discussion that went on for about 10 years, and it still really goes on. The two books, the book that Chris put together, Metamount Reflections, and the 100, I think have this in common. They're both about changes in Idaho, the things that change, the things that stay the same. Chris's book got started when he was kind of thinking about the fact that as he's writing columns for newspapers and for blogs like mine now, he's winding up coming back to a lot of the same subjects that he talked about for newspapers and elsewhere more than 40 years ago. Some of those subjects, and in some cases, some of those people, keep coming back around. There are places where they stay the same. There are places where they change, and that was part of the a little bit of impetus for us too with the Idaho 100. the book, The Idaho 100, is kind of a mosaic. You can look at these people and what they did, and you can see a certain thread, a certain piece of how Idaho changed or developed. The idea was that we were looking at the people who lived in Idaho, who made a big specific change on Idaho, and it had to be something that was an alteration that took the state off into a new direction. Last night when I was talking to some people in Ketchum, I asked them the question, how many are satisfied with the direction that the state of Idaho is going? I asked them to raise their hands. I don't think we got a single hand raised. I don't know whether that would necessarily be the same response here, but probably most people aren't even if they like a lot of the way Idaho is going, a lot of the direction that's been taken, there's probably not a lot of people who are satisfied with everything. And a good part of the point of doing a book like Idaho 100 is to point out that individual people really can make a difference and really can change a whole state. The number 3 person on the list was Ira Perrine, who's of course well known for the bridge here, and those of you who are well versed in history of the Magic Valley know what a central role he played in helping develop the irrigation and the communities that turned what had been just a desert land that travelers remarked on mainly out of their concern for just getting across into a place where you could develop farms, industries, where you could develop a whole community, a whole society, and really turn it into the Magic Valley. A lot of that comes back to the work that a single person did. When I traveled around the country some years back, I was on a travel with my wife visiting the 48 continental states, and would tell people that we were from Idaho. The response that we got back usually had some reference in it to potatoes. People were well aware of identifying Idaho with potatoes, and probably a lot of people in Idaho and elsewhere just thought that either developed either kind of naturally or maybe through some large organization or large committee, something like that. But a lot of it had to do with one man from the Magic Valley, Joe Marshall, and probably a lot of you know that. He was a potato farmer. He worked with a lot of other potato farmers. He recognized that the potatoes that were grown in this area were superior to some of those that they were just thrown into trucks with. So he set about nationally and even internationally trying to specifically identify Idaho potatoes as a separate and superior kind of product, and it made a big difference over time. That again could in large part be attributed to a single person. And so I guess the point that I'm coming back around to there is that I think that a lot of changes, important changes, one way or another, and in some cases for good or ill. There are people in our book that we included whose changes we thought were negative rather than positive as well. But changes can happen by the work of single individuals and small groups of people as well. Sometimes it doesn't feel that way. Sometimes it seems as though larger trends and forces are all, but they aren't necessarily all. They can individual people can still matter a whole lot in changing a community or a state or even more than that. I didn't want to go on speaking too long. Mainly wanted to see what questions that you had for Chris and I. So let me turn that over to any and all questions that you may have. The most obvious one. Some are debatable. Some depend on your point of view. But I think that, and even the one I'm about to mention that's true to a degree. Although I think that a very overwhelming portion of Idahoans would agree with me that Richard Butler, who was the head of the Aryan Nations for a couple of decades in the Idaho Panhandle, had a very negative influence on Idaho, identifying Idaho as being a place where neo-Nazis and Aryan Nations types like to go. And that was, I think that influence was almost all negative, although even there was a pushback on that. There were people who were supporting humanitarian interests that developed that interest and developed the support in part in response to the fact that that Butler and his people were there. So, in a lot of cases, there are pluses and minuses. The people that we have that we've noted in the book did a lot of things, and time will tell in a lot of cases which of them were wind up being very positive and which not. Chris has an interesting answer to this too. Since it kind of came in the context of the book, I'll do a quick answer there. We kept looking for more, but more than we had. But the fact is that in the 19th century, when a lot of things in Idaho and in other states, a lot of other western states, were being set up, were being founded, a lot of the people who specifically led a lot of those efforts and did a lot of those things were men. And the list is much more heavily weighted toward men than toward women, but there are a significant number of women on the list as well. There were political activists. Gwen Barnett, some of you who've been around Republican politics for a period of time would probably recognize that name. She was very influential during a very pivotal period in Idaho politics in the 60s. Verda Barnes, who was a key figure for Frank Church and a number of other people, without whom some major elected officials in Idaho would have never materialized. She's on the list. Georgia Davidson, who was really the founder of radio and TV broadcasting in southern Idaho, is on the list. Pramil French, who was worked at the University of Idaho, was a student dean up there, but also really in many ways kind of founded the education system in Idaho. There are a number. There aren't as many as we really would have liked, and we took some heat on exactly that fact when the book first came out. But I think there are a number that we included, and I think there's a case that can be made for some more. But Chris has a few thoughts along these lines too.
One of the chapters in the book is entitled "The Lioness of Idaho?" ? Many people are familiar that the great Idaho Senator William E. Borah was called the Lion of Idaho. So I threw out the question, who is the Lioness of Idaho? What female politically active figure would be worthy of that title? And I came up with what I call 5 first-tier candidates, and in the chapter I kind of make the case for each of them. Verda Barnes, as Randy referenced, Frank Church's chief of staff. It can be argued that Cecil Andrus would never have become governor had not Verda, at a critical moment in his career, made sure that he won an election that very few people know about. In 1966, you may recall, he ran for governor. He was defeated by Chuck Herndon. Chuck Herndon was killed in a plane crash a month later in the Sawtooth. So the nomination went to the Democratic Central Committee. A couple of powerful political bosses in those days, Tom Boise from the north and Lloyd Adams from Rexburg, wanted to make sure that Andrus was not the nominee. They talked Max Hansen from Camas County, who was the federal state agricultural director, into being a candidate. There's a beautiful vignette of Max Hansen walking down to the Boise post office the night before the Central Committee meets, mailing in his resignation. He didn't realize that Verda Barnes stayed up all night and would stay up all night, and she made dozens and dozens of phone calls, and when the smoke cleared the next morning after the balloting of the Central Committee, Cecil Andrus won by 1 vote. Now, many people will tell you that had he not been, fractured though that race was, the Democratic nominee in 1966, he probably wouldn't have been the Democratic nominee in 1970. So you can make a very plausible case that she's the reason that he became the historical figure that he did. I also talk extensively about one of the key Republican female mentors or mentoresses, if you will, Louise Shattuck, a good friend of many people in this room. She mentored all sorts of Republican aspirants right up to her day that she died on her 93rd year. She was a remarkable figure and a historical fact that you could all win a bet on in a bar someplace. What state had the first 2 women nominated to run by the major parties for a congressional seat? It's Idaho, 1956. Louise Shattuck challenged 1st District incumbent Congresswoman Gracie Post, and that's the first time the Republicans and the Democrats had a woman as their nominee. There's a very formidable case for both of those, and I more or less leave it up to the reader and future historians. But I also put Gracie Post in the first tier, Helen Chenoweth in the first tier, and Bethine Church. She was a formidable campaigner in her own right. And then I list some other very talented women who haven't received, in my view, the recognition that they're entitled to. People like Sandy Bottano, Larry Craig, State's Chief of Staff, a remarkably competent individual. She could have been the 1st District Congresswoman after that seat was vacated by Butch Otter. Ruthie Johnson, who was a key aide to Jim McClure. Sean Keogh, the state senator from Bonner County, who I think has got a great future potentially. She's been in the legislature 17 years. She's got a great reputation. Good conservative, but very pro-education. Senator Marguerite McLaughlin is another one. Mary Lou Reed. Michelle Stinnett, I think, has got a good future. Wendy Jackwood, I'm sorry she left the legislature, is very competent. So there are a number of really quality female political practitioners out there, and someday the glass ceiling is going to be broken. Other questions?
Oh, okay. Go ahead. Suggestion was about one of the next books that I'll be working on. I've been working on with a former Idaho State legislator who has been heavily involved with researching for years now the Diamond Field Jack Davis case, which some of you, if you're familiar with a century plus of history in the region, you'll be familiar with that. He has Max Black, who was a representative from Boise for quite a while, has found a remarkable number of pieces of information, whole caches of information, and bits and pieces of physical evidence, including a bullet in the ground at the killing site that had been there for more than a century, and pulled that together. And that book, his findings and how he found them, that should be coming out in another month to 6 weeks or so. That'll be called Diamond Field. And it. Oh, go ahead. I gather that I was getting the signal that we were running out of time, but go right ahead. Yes, number I believe 10 out of the list. Although, and it's kind of unfortunate in a way because that had to do with interaction with the people who are coming in. There was a woman of one of the Nez Perce bands named Wetsowis, who had been familiar with the settlers further in the east. She had known about them. When Lewis and Clark came through northern Idaho and the Weite Prairie, they were sick, they were injured, they were in a bad way, and when the Nez Perce encountered them, there were quite a few of them who had been hearing these bad rumors about people like this out in the east, and there was a strong sentiment that what they ought to do is just kill them and be done with it. She convinced them not to do that. turn that around, convince them to help them get better, send them on their way to the Pacific, and I think as a result of that, the history of the Northwest was a lot different. She's actually the highest ranking woman on the list. Matter of opinion.